Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel discussion is none other than the men who broke the sound barrier. And as they come up, while David introduces them, I'd like to go ahead and roll the video, please, just for those of you that haven't seen it.
First, quickly, Bob Cardenas, distinguished military career, combat commander, highly decorated test pilot, was flying the B-29 in all of the XS-1 drops. Bob Hoover, World War II POW for 16 months in Germany. And for those of you who have not heard this, he escaped and went to an almost deserted German airfield, found a serviceable Focke-Wulf 190, and flew it out to safety and to freedom. Bob has, as you all know, a distinguished career, one of the great aerobatic pilots, one of the great test pilots, flown over 300 airplanes. He was flying chase that day. He took the famous picture that you've all seen of the Bell XS-1 with the diamonds out behind it. He was flying chase that day. Chuck Yeager, of course, a distinguished career, double ace, flying Mustangs from England in World War II. Test pilot, flew the Bell XS-1. Was at right field, is probably the youngest test pilot there, but still got the call by Colonel Boyd to be the primary pilot on the Bell XS-1. Distinguished career, flying every conceivable airplane, commandant of the test pilot school, training astronauts, trained 26 of our astronauts when he was commandant of the test pilot school, and went on to his continued career as a commander in the military and retired as a brigadier general. So there's our panel, gentlemen. I was going to hold this till later, but after we saw the Bell XS-1 come down and do a roll, that looked like a powered flight. Was that a powered flight?
No, it was my first glide flight.
First glide flight. And
yes,
what
sir.
was the profile, according to Colonel Boyd, that he wanted you to fly on that flight?
He didn't give us one. Yeah, we're 3,000 miles away. No, that was the first glide flight. We made 3 glide flights on the airplane, so we had no power. And Cardenas kicked us out around 220 or 230. Stalling speed was around 190 at that speed. So I just rolled it when I dropped away from the B-29. And after Hoover had just about shook us out of the B-29 with his damn P-80, and I came on down and stalled the airplane, felt it out, and then landed on the lake bed. That was the first glide flight. Second glide flight, I did the same thing. After Hoover about shook me out of the airplane again, he just had a habit of buzzing the B-29 right under the X-1, pulling up in front of it, and then Cardenas would cuss, and I would cuss. And then the third glide flight, my last one, when I dropped out of it, the B-29, Hoover had already buzzed us and went under us and was turning back in to us. So I turned into him. We got in a Loughbury all the way down to the lake bed and landed. And that was all on the card. So, now, you want to go back a little bit about how did
let's go back for those, because everybody's so young here. Let's go back. Bell gets the contract, right, to build an airplane.
Why? Why? We, like when Bob and I were flying combat in Europe, we ran into compressibility in 43, 44, and 45, obviously, in the Mustang and the Spit and other airplanes. And we knew that a problem existed because of the effects of the speed of sound and buffeting, and consequently the Air Force did too. So the engineering division at Wright Field and Ezra Cochran, Major, and other engineers said, why don't we build an airplane that'll fly in the region of the speed of sound and see if we can't find out what the problems are because of the effects of the speed of sound and solve them. And they went to Bell. Bell said, you know, looking at technology that was available to them, said we can probably build an airplane for a certain amount of money. And the unknowns were many. And the Air Force then gave a contract to Bell to build the XS-1, X Research S Supersonic 1, first contract for a research airplane. And basically, Bell used technology like the fuselage was shaped like a 50 caliber bullet, because bullets go faster in sound, obviously. They built the wings. The first airplane they built, 6062, had an 8% wing thickness to chord ratio and a 6% tail. Now, they stressed the airplane to pull 18 Gs, positive or negative. That's more than the pilot could take. Then, since it would be rocket propelled with liquid oxygen and water alcohol, they decided to drop it from the B-29 to save the fuel it would take to get up there. And besides, the gear was not structurally capable of taking off with a full load of fuel, which is 300 gallons of liquid oxygen and 300 gallons of alcohol. And that's what Bell came out with the X-1. Now, what do we power the airplane with? We have no hydraulic system, electrical systems other than a battery to run the radio and the internal recorders and telemetry system. So they ended up building the airplane with 5,000 pounds of nitrogen gas pressure manifolded in the X-1. Now, they ran that source of 5,000 pounds into the cockpit through a first stage dome regulator that the pilot controlled, reducing it to 1,500 pounds. That was used to lower and raise the gear and to run the flaps down. Then we split that to 2 more dome regulators in the cockpit to reduce it down to roughly 380 pounds, which was used to pressurize a liquid oxygen tank for 1 dome regulator, the fuel tank with the other dome regulator. Now that forced the fuel back to the rocket motor and ran propellant valves that let you run the rocket motor.
And you had four motors, right?
4 chambers. It was an XLR-11 engine. Each chamber put out 1,500 pounds of thrust. You had 4 switches on the instrument panel, and you could burn 1, 2, 3, or 4, or any combination 2. If you ran one, you had 10 minutes of power, 2, 5, and all 4, 2.5 minutes at full power, 6,000 pounds total. Now, you know, being a rocket, if you're sitting at 35,000 feet, you're getting 6,000 pounds of thrust out of it. Jets don't operate that way. The airplane, I have to explain, when the Air Force gave the contract to Bell, NACA had the responsibility for research flying. Military pilots were never allowed to do research flying. We did stability and control, you know, performance and verification of performance of an airplane that the company put out. We had a test pilot school. It was formed in 1944, and consequently, when the Air Force finished the contract with Bell, Bell built the airplane. The first airplane rolled out. Civilian test pilots flew the airplane. NACA had the responsibility for research, and consequently, they guarded this responsibility very jealously. And they were in charge of the whole X-1 program, and they had Jack Willems was a Bell test pilot that flew the airplane the first 10 glide flights in Florida, creamed it 2 or 3 times because he had a little trouble overshooting. And consequently, he killed himself in the Cleveland Air Races in a P-39, and Slick Goodland took the airplane over. Now, we watched this, like Hoover and I came into right field in the summer of '45. I was a maintenance officer in the fighter test section, and we didn't test airplanes. And Bob came in about September '45, and, you know, we didn't do a hell of a lot other than running functional test flights on airplanes. We'd jump the test pilots and wax their fanny, and we weren't very popular. And Bob was one of the best fighter pilots I think I've run into, and I was quite surprised that he was only a lieutenant.
Let me go back just a little bit about since you brought it. A couple of things keep popping into my question. Bob, when Chuck talked about the fact it was important to drop the Bell XS-1 from the B-29, How complicated a job was it? How difficult was it to modify the B-29 to do this? And how tricky, if it was, to fly and to take off in the B-29 with the Bell X-1 underneath it?
Well, they modified the B-29, and my job, I picked up the B-29 at the depot, and my orders were to go up to Bell, load it in, carry it out, but also stop by Wright Pat, pick up the rest of the crew. Now, Boyd had already talked to Chuck, already talked to Jack. He'd picked the whole crew. I was the last guy.
This is Colonel Al Boyd, who was the chief of flight test at Wright Field.
Flight test division.
So he called me in, and so he handed me this one piece of paper, and he said, "You realize the Air Force is on the spot. This is a research project. The first time the Air Force has been given the job of research. So I've already talked to Chuck and Bob about safety and whatnot. You're going to be the operations officer. The project is to be brief, progressive, and brief. Safety of flight is paramount, but is not to impede success."
Can you imagine a bomber pilot telling a fighter pilot that safety is a primary factor? But Jesus Christ.
Well, I'd flown fighters also, but I was chief of bomber test. That's why they gave me the B-29. And I followed orders. I picked up the Bell 6th July, I believe it was, and Chuck went through 14 October, July, August, September, October. That was progressive and it was brief.
Okay, Bob, when there were about 125 pilots, right, test pilots at Wright Field, and Colonel Boyd, I understand, anybody who wanted to go for this was able to be considered, and he picked Chuck as number one and you as backup. How difficult was that for you at the time, and how difficult it's been since then, that you were backup and he would never essentially let you fly the airplane?
Well, David, the way it really occurred is that I had been selected first by Bill Council, who's the head of flight test before Boyd came on board. And Boyd came on board, and he said, I had buzzed Springfield Airport for Pete Everest. He had told him that he was flying jets, and he wasn't. And he said, if you have any fuel left over, how about buzzing Springfield? Which I did. Costliest flight I ever had. 3 months later, he called me into his office, and he said, I know two things about you, young man. He said, I want you to tell me, did you buzz the Springfield Airport on such and such a date? I said, yes, sir, I certainly did. He said, well, the two things I know about you is that you're honest, but you're irresponsible. And he said, I'm going to keep you on the program, and I'm going to choose somebody else. And I said, yes, sir. And I was downhearted and just heartbroken because the other people that were in the pyramid to get the project were people that both Chuck and I did not have a lot of respect for as far as their flying ability was concerned. And a couple of weeks later, he called me in, and I was standing there at attention, and he said, I've figured out who I'm going to have the primary pilot. And he said, do you know Chuck Yeager? And I couldn't help but get a smile on my face. I felt Chuck was the greatest aviator I'd ever gone up against. And when he told me that, I could hardly contain myself. I was just so tickled to death. He and I were pals, and it was just a delightful relief for me to get to work with Bob and Chuck and the rest of our crew.
Here are three members of the team. The other three were Jack Ridley, Lieutenant Colonel Engineer, Dick Frost, and Jack Russell. All right, Jack Russell was what, a
Jack
test pilot
Russell was
engineer?
a crew chief on the X-1 from the time he worked for Bell Aircraft Company. Dick Frost was an ex-P-39 test pilot for Bell Aircraft who had been burned. Was a very good, he knew the X-1 intimately. And so he had also been monitoring the test program when Slick Goodland was assigned as a test pilot on the X-1 flew 20 powered flight. Now, the question I'm sure in a lot of people's mind, why did the Air Force take over the X-1? Now, when they finished phase 1, 20 powered flights and 0.8 Mach, hell, we've been fighting the war at 0.8, and consequently, the next phase called to take it out to supersonic speeds are 1.1, and Slick Goodland wanted a $150,000 bonus to do it. And that's when the Air Force, who owned the airplane, and NACA, who was doing the instrumentation and sort of monitoring and co-supervising the program with Bell, the Air Force bowed us back and said, we haven't got that kind of money in the program. That's when Colonel Boyd talked the Air Force into taking the X-1 and assigning it to the Flight Test Division. And as Bob said, we were picked as, I ended up as primary because of my maintenance background probably, and Bob was my backup pilot. And then we were sent out to Muroc. Now, NACA, who had had responsibility for all research flying, and military had never been in it, as I mentioned, guarded their position very jealously, and to a point of where there was a little bit of animosity between them and us on the X-1 team from the military, and it at times got a little bit terse. And Ridley was a guy who was a brain. He had a master's degree out of Caltech and under Dr. von Karman, and Jack Ridley was a brilliant engineer, as well as a very good pilot. He and Bob and I were classmates in a test pilot school in 1946. Now, that's when we got out there, the military did not have instrumentation for research flying. We had to bring NACA in. And so they brought him in with Walt Williams, was the head of theirs, a rather pompous individual that didn't particularly care about military guys, thought they were, especially if they were high school graduates. And they, and that's the way we ended up out there. And as Bob was the B-29 driver, and Hoover and I, the way I remember it and saw it, Ridley and I made the decision as to what I was going to do with the airplane, because he was a brilliant engineer. And when Jack opened his mouth, Walt Williams and the NACA guys shut up and listened. And that's the way we started the program.
Okay, the 6 of you, yeah, Bob.
My problem was, number one, keeping track of where Bob and Chuck were and keeping NACA off her back, because as he said, there was a little animosity. We had to work with them as a team because they had some of the ground equipment. But as he said, Jackie and Chuck laid out the flight plan. I remember one time we were talking at the Hyatt, and Lockheed engineer asked me, he said, you guys, you had a computer, didn't you? And I said, no, we didn't have a computer. He said, you had to have. I said, why? He said, well, you needed a computer to develop an energy maneuverability curve for Chuck to fly. I said, well, if it'll make you feel better, we didn't know what an energy maneuverability curve was. But that was the team. They handled the X-1. I kept NACA at bay a little bit and didn't interfere.
All right, you had the three glide flights, and then you start powered flights. You start working up to it. Where did Ridley fit into this? How significant was Ridley in this process of figuring out?
Every pre-flight meeting that Jack and I had with NACA to try to pick their brain, because they, had some data, wind tunnel data, out to about 0.9 Mach. We didn't. And consequently, we'd sit down and talk to NACA. Now, NACA's objective in this X-1 program was meticulously, slowly advancing the speed on the airplane. Hell, we'd still been out there flying it if we'd listened to them. And our job, as General Boyd sent us out to do, was get the airplane above Mach 1 as soon as you can. Don't bust your butt and don't embarrass the Air Force. That's the only thing he told us, and that's about the way we looked at it. And now, first powered flight, I made ground runs, so I knew the airplane, and it was quite well. So I Bob dropped me out at 20,000 feet. Every time I flew the X-1, it was about 40 some times, Bob would count 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. He would always miss 4 or 3. So I really, in fact, I was on the cover of Time magazine. It says 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1. Printed. It was real good.
I was doing that to catch his attention.
And then, consequently, I dropped out and at 240 indicated, which was a stalling speed of the airplane. And basically, we always lost a little liquid oxygen in the front tank on the climb out because of evaporation. So I'd drop with an aft CG, and even 240 would give me in a partial stall, and I'd have trouble getting the nose down to pick up some speed. And then I already had the domes loaded, everything ready to fire. I'd fire off 1, 2, or 3. On this, my first powered flight, General Boyd said, well, since the airplane's been to 8.2 Mach number, you can go out there. Well, I should have listened more carefully. And
so 0.82 was the point that day? Or
yeah, that was my first powered flight. And I remember dropping out, firing off one chamber, and I wanted to check out the motor at altitude. I fired off one chamber, and then a second chamber, one chamber off, third chamber, one chamber off, second chamber off, and ran across the bay. And then at the fourth one, I pulled up and did a roll. Well, when I got the negative G in the roll, a lock scavitated, and my motor flamed out. When it rolled out and got positive, it fired again. I wasn't doing anything. So I enjoyed flying the airplane. It was real smooth. So I got, after about half of the fuel was gone, I turned the motor off that I had on and rolled over and went down across Edwards, or Muir Air Base. And they had some dignitaries out there. And I just wanted to show them that, this was not NACA, and this is not civilian, this is military.
You were 24 years old, right?
Yeah, I should have. I went down the runway, no motor on, I was cutting about 500 miles an hour because the airplane's heavy and very clean. And as I came to the end of the runway and pulled it up, I fired all 4 chambers. I couldn't go 0 G, so I ended up having to do a roll to keep, about a half a G positive. And the thing got, and that first thing I was looking at is a 0.85 Mach on the Mach meter, and it was really smoking. And I finally raked it off and jettisoned the fuel and came down and landed. And really, he was a wonderful flight test engineer. He wrote the pilot's report for me and sent it back to right field. With a friend like him who needs an enemy. Man, we went to 8.5, General Boyd, or Colonel Boyd, all this crap. And
did the Colonel respond to this in any way?
Christ, man, here's this letter. You will reply by endorsement as to why you exceeded 8.2 Mach number. And I said, Ridley, you SOB, you wrote the flight, you answered. He said, no, I didn't fly it, you answered. So, anyway, he wasn't too hot about it. And he said later in life, he said, I really was a little bit pleased that you'd do something like that.
How many flights until you went supersonic? What happened that day?
8.5, about 8.7, 9. Now, the big thing that bit us when we ran into buffeting at 8.8 because of the thin wings, when we got out to 0.94 Mach. Now, this is how the crude things were in the old days. When Bob and I were flying P-84s and P-80, you could take a P-84 straight wing out to 0.82 Mach and it would buffet. You could back up to 0.75 where it's smooth, pull about 3 Gs, and you got the same buffet there that you got at 8.2 straight and level. So I use this technique with the X1 because I thought maybe like if I get to 0.9 Mach and pull 3 Gs, it'll give me a feel what I'll get at 9.2 or 9.3. And this is all we knew, and it was a rather crude way to do flight test work, but we knew nothing else. And when I got the airplane out to 0.94, I rolled it over and come back on the control. Nothing happened. The airplane just went straight, and it flopped back and forward. And we came down and Ridley said, we got a real problem, Jack. And it'd been predicted the airplane pitch up or down the region of speed of sound. And Jack said, we had manometer hold. We could trace this shock wave which had formed on the thickest part of the horizontal stabilizer and the wing. And as we went through, this happened at 8.8. When we got to 9.4, the shock wave was what at the elevator, at the hinge point. We lost our effectiveness. And Jack was the guy that figured out, Bell had put a jack screw and the leading edge of horizontal stabilizer tied into this jack screw, air motor on the top, air motor on the bottom, and we used 100 pounds of nitrogen gas pressure that went back to it and split, and I could control it through a solenoid switch on the control column to divert to the top motor or the bottom motor to run this jack screw, and when we ran it, the leading edge of horizontal stabilizer would change angle of incidence. So Jack figured all this out and said, let's try it, you know, because we have no control over the airplane. It's predicted to pitch up or down the region of speed of sound. So we took the cowling off and put some 3-in-1 oil on and ran this thing up and down and got it to working. And then I took it up on the next flight and took it out to 9.4 where I'd lost the elevators and changed the leading edge down 1 degree, and it pulled 3 Gs. And I said, yeah, we got this thing licked. And it came down, and it only took me 2 more flights. The next flight, I took it to about 9.7. The Mach meter only went to 1.0. I don't think they had a hell of a lot of confidence in it. But it was really... Anyway, I was sitting there looking at, on October the 14th, the 9th powered flight, looking at 9.65, 9.7, and the needle fluctuated and went off the scale. When it did, all the buffeting quit, and the airplane, boy, really nosed down. I cranked the leading edge down to hold the nose up. And I kept it out there off the scale for about 20 seconds, which extrapolated to about 107, 108 Mach number. Came back, and that's a big thing, came out of the whole X-1 program. It took the British and the French and the Soviet Union 5 years to find out that little trick. If you're going to fly at supersonic speed, you got to have a slab tail. And that big thing came out. Bob was supposed to fly the next week, and bailed out of a damn P-84 and broke both his legs, and he never did get to fly the airplane. I wanted him to fly it, but Jack Ridley got to fly it. He was funny because the cockpit's pressurized pure nitrogen, so you have to breathe 100% oxygen. And Ridley's up there, and they had a big fire warning light in it. And he was smoking out there at about 1.1, and he said, geez, I got a fire warning light. And I said, hell, Jack, there ain't nothing in there that'll burn, meaning it has nitrogen gas and inert gas in there, so nothing can burn. He said, the hell they ain't, I'm in here. Anyway, damn Hoover, every time we flew, he was up in a P-80, and he was a big help because what he would do, he'd go up to about 40,000 feet and con about 10 miles in front of the B-29. When I dropped out, I could pick him up, and then his aim point for me. But before he went up there, he would come under the B-29 and pull up right in front and just shake up a Jesus. I think the X-one's coming out.
Bob, why did you do that?
Hell, he's Bob Hoover, that's why.
David, let me tell you, I was sitting there at, I believe, 42,000 feet on October the 14th. And I saw Chuck coming up at me. I was watching as best I could see him, waiting for him to get up close.
Yeah, he had a reconnaissance RF-80 that took beautiful pictures. That's for one reason.
And I'll tell you why. He came by me, and I was watching him approach me. And there was no question in my mind. I was sitting there at 8/10 Mach number, and I felt I was standing still. Right on by. And I tell you, that was a happy day. When we started downhill, I got with Chuck as soon as he emptied all his fuel out. And I joined him. And on the way down, I said, Pard, you're going to get a free steak dinner at Poncho's tonight.
Now, she offered a free steak dinner first guy to go Mach 1. And really wasn't very good.
It was really interesting. While we were building up to this program, there was a fellow, and I won't mention his name, but one of the other aircraft companies, and we were in Poncho's bar, and he came over to Chuck and me, and he said, you guys don't stand a chance. I'm going to get there before you.
Gene Mays?
Yeah.
Douglas.
He said, it was Douglas test pilot. And I said, well, Mr. Mays, I said, I don't really think 10,000 hours of steerman time is going to help you very much. You know?